I call this meeting to order. Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the meeting of the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying. I'd like to begin by welcoming members of the committee, our witnesses, as well as those watching this meeting on the web. My name is Yana Martin, and I'm the Senate Joint Chair of this committee, and I'm joined by the Honorable Mark Garneau, the House of Commons Joint Chair. Today we are continuing our examination of the statutory review of the provisions of the Criminal Code relating to medical assistance in dying and their application. So a few administrative items. I'd like to remind members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted unless recognized by the Joint Chair, and a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the Joint Chairs. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. Interpretation in this video conference will work like an in-person committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first panel of witnesses who are here to discuss MAID when a mental disorder is the sole underlying medical condition. So our witnesses are, as an individual, Ellen Cohen, National Coordinator Advocate, National Mental Health Inclusion Network. We also have Dr. Cornelia Wyman, Deputy Chief Medical Officer. And lastly, d'Association des médecins psychiatristes du Québec.
The Association of Médecins Psychiatrists du Québec, Dr. Guillaume Barbès-Morin.
We will begin with opening remarks. Each will be 5 minutes in length, which I will try and carefully time. So we'll begin with Ms. Cohen, followed by Dr. Wyman, and then Dr. Barbès-Morin. Ms. Cohen, you have 5 minutes. Would you please unmute?
I'm really nervous. I'm really sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. I hope everyone is well. My name is Ellen Cohen, and I'm here today as an independent witness willing to share my expertise built on my professional and personal experiences. For over 30 years, I have worked in the mental health consumer sector. I'm a person with mental health challenges, 2 chronic health conditions, and a family member. I need you to know that there is a lot on the line for me today, and I'm nervous. This is so much larger than all of us. The recommendations that you make to the government can make a big difference for people I support, persons with disability, and people with mental health conditions living in Canada. Who is not touched by mental illness? Mental illness affects everyone. People with disabilities make up 22% of the population. That represents 6.2 million people living in Canada. Among youth age 15 to 24 with disabilities, 60% claim to have mental health related disabilities. All too often, some professionals do not understand that people with intellectual, physical, and sensory disabilities can also have mental health conditions that are not related to any disability they may have. I know that some of the problems were made as a major concern for our communities include poverty, lack of food security, safe housing, access to health care, mental health care, and addiction services. There's also systemic discrimination, to mention a few. I was invited onto the panel representing mental health from the disability perspective, which I did. The disability community is diverse, and I know that mental health consumer survivors are divided on the issue of MAID. Despite what was said by Dr. Gupta in her testimony to the members of this committee, I came onto this expert panel with an open mind. As a member of the panel, I was responsible to voice my opinion, to make recommendations and safeguards where mental illness as the sole underlying medical condition was applying for MAID. Since the beginning of the process, there were challenges, including the composition of the expert panel. It was made up of 7 doctors, 5 or 6 who provided assessments, one palliative care family doctor working with marginalized people 2 doctors from the Indigenous community, a psychiatric ethicist, 2 lawyers, 2 community members from mental health community, and myself, a member from the disability/mental health community. From the beginning of the panel, those who were assessors talked about the difficulties they were experiencing with track 2 patients in general. They shared about the complications and difficulties of assessment. Those difficulties are not clear to me, nor were they transparent. The assessors also shared about the amount of time needed for each assessment and talked about the fair compensation that the work that is expected of MAID assessors. There was no space made for meaningful discussions on the seriously complicated issues of vulnerability. Sorry. Sorry. There was no space made for meaningful discussion on seriously complicated issues concerning decision-making, consent and capacity, accountability, monitoring, privilege, vulnerability. That just did not happen in the context of people suffering with mental health disorders. When the discussion of mental illness came up, the discussion was shut down or we moved on. When suggestions were brought forward, panel members were discouraged due to time constraints. When I did suggest something, I was shamed by the only other peer on the panel, stating that having specific safeguards for those suffering from mental disorder was discrimination. Under Bill C7, I believe there is a big difference between people requesting MAID for incurable and disabling conditions and those who are requesting MAID for mental illness as the sole medical condition. I ask you, is this a lack of resources or bureaucracy? I believe that the outcome of the panel was a foregone conclusion, becoming clear that some of the expert panels had very little appetite to make any attempt at recommendations regarding the addition of legislative safeguards for any amendments to Bill C7 in regards to mental health disability. After reading the Quebec decision and giving it some thought, it became obvious to me that there were too many unanswered questions and issues in determining and assessing requests for track 2 patients without adding to it the request from people with mental illness that will be available come March 2023. So I left the panel. Through this whole process, there was limited discussions about mental illness as the sole medical condition for requiring MAID. The process was rushed. 7 months from our first meeting was not enough time to decide about life and death. It was not enough time to consult with the community that Bill C7 is endangering. I would also like to point out that this parliamentary process is also being rushed. Thank you for allowing me to share my story.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. Thank you very much. And we'll next hear from Dr. Cornelia Wyman.
Bonjour, bonjour, Ani. Good morning, bonjour. I would like to thank the joint chairs, vice chairs, members, honorable senators, and members of parliament for the invitation to appear before you. My name is Dr. Cornelia Nell Wyman, and I'm originally from Little Grand Rapids First Nation in Treaty 5 territory, Manitoba, part of the Anishinaabe Nation. I now live, work, and play in the traditional, unceded, ancestral, and continually occupied territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm the first Indigenous woman in Canada to train as a psychiatrist and have over 20 years of experience in clinical practice in a variety of settings, including rural, on-reserve, urban, and tertiary care emergency psychiatry departments. It would be difficult to quantify how many psychiatric assessments I have conducted over more than 2 decades, though I would estimate at a minimum several thousand. I most recently completed a 6-year term as the president of the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada and currently serve as the Deputy Chief Medical Officer at the First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia. However, I'm not speaking to you today in either of those leadership capacities. I am providing my testimony as an individual, as a psychiatrist, and as a member of the expert panel on MAID and mental illness that tabled our final report in May of this year. I will highlight a few key messages in these opening remarks and then look forward to further discussion in the Q&A period to follow. From section 1.5 of the final report of the expert panel, in quotations, Indigenous people in Canada have unique perspectives on death which need to be considered in the context of MAID, including MAID, MD Sum C. However, engagement with Indigenous peoples in Canada concerning MAID has yet to occur. Hearing from additional witnesses, including myself, cannot be considered to be a fulsome consultation with First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. Perspectives of MAID are on a spectrum. I have heard of medically assisted deaths occurring in First Nations communities that are grounded in ceremony, where the whole community is aware of what's happening and the dying person was drummed into the next world. On the other end of the spectrum are those who are still acutely distressed by their individual experiences of historical, intergenerational, and contemporary traumas that their view of MAID is that it is their view of MAID is that it essentially amounts to genocide. This becomes even more complicated when we consider MAID in the MD Sum C category. There is the potential for spread of misinformation, as we have seen during the COVID pandemic, to the extent that some people believe Indigenous youth who are suicidal will be able to access MAID. We all know that would not be allowed to happen, but these are reasons why broader engagement is necessary. Lastly, I will note the fatigue of First Nations communities associated with engagement and consultation, speaking from my experience in British Columbia. There has been so much going on over the past several years that communities have had to contend with, that asking for further consultation at this time on a highly charged topic such as MAID in general and MAID MD Sum C specifically is daunting. First Nations communities are more likely to want to discuss the youth suicide crisis than MAID MD Sum C, and yet they must be consulted. This committee has no doubt has heard from other witnesses or is aware of some of the challenges that many Indigenous people face in terms of the social determinants of health, placing them in situations of vulnerability. Having a mental illness, inadequate or unstable housing, being under or unemployed, food insecurity can all contribute to physical and mental suffering, and assessments for MAID MD Sum C will have to grapple with trying to tease out this type of suffering from that related to an incurable, irreversible mental disorder. And how can this suffering be alleviated, especially in rural and remote settings where health and social services, programs, and resources are already scarce and inadequate? Some of these issues are summarized in a statement from the expert panel's final report. In quotations, as a result of the creation of laws that provide access to MAID, concerns have been raised by Indigenous leaders and communities that it is easier for people in their communities to access a way to die rather than to access the resources they need to live well. End of quotations. I note in the interim report of the Special Joint Committee from June 2022 some discussion on the issue of access to health services, both in reference to all Canadians, including Indigenous people in Canada, having equitable access to MAID assessments if requested, and having access to the healthcare services and programs they may need to prevent irremediable suffering. However, we must expand our understanding of access to not just mean having a healthcare professional, team, or services available to provide care in a reasonable amount of time. Medical care and attention can be impeded by people choosing not to access services because, in this instance, anti-Indigenous racism and discriminatory treatment. Indigenous people choose not to access health services out of a fear of how they will be treated. It will be imperative that cultural safety is assured in clinical care related to MAID and MAID MD Sum C. This would include having access to both Western medical and traditional healing and supports. I thank you again for the opportunity to participate in the session today. Look forward to our discussion and encourage you to continue to seek out the perspectives of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and organizations in the work of this committee. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Thank you, Dr. Wyman. And lastly, we'll have Dr. Barbet-Morin.
Oui, bonjour, membres du comité.
Good morning to the committee members. I'll be speaking French. My name is Guillaume Barbès-Morin. I'm a psychiatric doctor, and I'm before you as a representative of the Advisory Committee on Medical Aid in Dying of the Association of Psychiatric Doctors in Quebec. I've been working as a psychiatrist in a small community of Quebec, Rouyn-Noranda, near the Ontario frontier in the north, 45,000 people, far from Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. I work with the general population from adolescence to the end of life in various clinical settings, emergency clinic, external clinics. I evaluate people who have simple problems for their treating doctors, but also people who present very serious problems who will need medical support and care for their whole lives. Often I've been asked to be a consultant in situations where people are currently asking for medical assistance in dying, and where one is wondering if their mental state gives them the ability to make these decisions. In terms of the advisory committee of our association, its position states that it's essential that everyone understands that we're not here to promote MAID in a general way when mental illness is a sole condition for requiring it. Our position rests on the fact that, in our opinion, there is no clinical justification for systematically refusing all requests for medical assistance in dying on the basis of medical diagnosis with a sole condition being mental illness. People who are presenting in that situation deserve to be heard, that their suffering may be heard and evaluated in the context of MAID. However, we are very aware that this must be made in an adequate way, an appropriate way, which is why the committee has been working on it. And so it's essential to understand that MAID should never replace access to appropriate treatment for mental disorders that are available. An important issue that I would like to mention is that, in our opinion, the complexity of the requests for medical assistance in dying is well known by doctors assessing the situations for MAID currently, in situations where people have a great vulnerability already at the social level and in other areas. So in terms of the vulnerability of people presenting mental disorders, it's nothing new, and there are already mechanisms that take that into consideration. And clinicians turn to multidisciplinary teams to evaluate all aspects of the situation. For our committee, it's very important to understand clearly that mental health issues are problems of very serious mental illnesses that would be at play in requests for MAID. For us, it's important to consider psychological suffering, mental suffering, which is very present in our society at all levels, and mental illness. Mental illness, serious mental illness, which is something very specific and which is fortunately very rare. And so it's important, in our opinion, to distinguish between all these things. In my personal practice, over hundreds of patients that have been assessed, I wanted to assess how many of those people could have been termed or as by known criteria for MAID. There were 3 or 4 patients in my 16 years of practice who would have been eligible. So these are situations where the illness is very serious, and people whose problems were not eased with all the treatments that we were able to offer and to which they had access. So they were very serious illnesses. So that's what I wanted to tell you today, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
For lending us your important, recommendations and insights on a very complex and difficult matter such as MAID. So we'll go to our first round of questions, and each of our members will have 5 minutes as a reminder, unless you're sharing your time. So for the first round, we have Mr. Barrett for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Madam Co-Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for joining us this morning and providing us with your testimony. I'd like to ask Ms. Cohen some questions through you, Madam Co-Chair, if I could. Good morning, Ms. Cohen. How are you doing?
Morning, and I'm very nervous. Thank you.
Okay, well, I appreciate it, that it can be put you on, get your nerves up speaking with a joint committee of Canada's Parliament. But you're here as our guest, so and we're very interested in what you have to say. I'd like to zero in on your comments about safeguards, and during your time on the expert panel, what were the safeguards that you recommended?
Well, one of the things I felt strongly about is that mental health legislation across Canada varies. And in Canada, our mental health legislation allows for people to be treated and held against their will legally because of their illness. And I think that that needs to be looked at. I understand that you're the federal government, but I believe that if the intention is to move forward with MAID as a treatment for mental illness, I think that we really need to, as a country, look into the mental health legislation and ensure that the coercive situations and behaviors that are implied in the legislation are dealt with. We are people, and we need to be treated as such. We need to have laws that protect us, not laws that harm us. I repeatedly raised concern about MAID in this context, and I was not at all satisfied with the answers I received. And there was really no space for any discussion about it.
So if I can ask, what were the answers that you received? That is to say, why were your recommendations rejected?
Well, because I understood that it's jurisdictional issues. There are jurisdictional issues, and I understand that it's not Canada's responsibility. However, Canada does have the wherewithal to move forward to do something. In BC, there's an organization that's funded by the BC Law Society to look into the mental health legislation in British Columbia. And that came about as a result of the UN Rapporteur for Persons with Disabilities scathing report on Canada's MAID regime, as well as mental health situations that are occurring in BC.
What are the safeguards that have been recommended by the expert panel?
None. I don't believe there were any safeguards recommended. They
Why do you think that is?
They ended up that one of the expert panel ultimately ended up recommending that if a person is in a situation of involuntary confinement, that it would be okay after 6 months if they wanted to apply for medical assistance in dying, they could do so. So on one hand, we have the provinces and the provincial government saying you cannot choose to be free. And then on the other hand, we have the federal government offering medical assistance in dying as a treatment.
The last thing I wanted to touch on
Or an
quickly, if I
option.
could, ma'am, is just about your resignation from the panel. Ms. Gupta told our committee that despite your initial willingness to participate, you realized that given your public opposition, you couldn't reconcile your personal position with the work of the panel. Is that accurate?
No, it's not at all. I came into this from my first conversation with Abby Hoffman and Karen Kirsch, saying that I do have problems with it. However, my community, the mental health community, the consumer movement is very split by this. I have friends and family members who definitely believe that medical assistance in dying should be allowed for people who are prepared and who are ready to do so. I've never said that I am against medical assistance in dying for people with mental illness. However, that being said, vulnerable people, the majority of people with mental illness live in poverty. We're talking about the upper middle class and privileged people who may be applying for medical assistance in dying because of their mental illness.
Thank you,
But when
Ms.
it
Cohen.
comes time to,
Thank you.
sorry.
Yes, we are actually a little bit over on that.
Thank you,
but
ma'am.
Thank you very much. Next, we will have Monsieur Arsenault.
Merci, Madame la coprésidente. Madame Cohen, vous...
Ms. Cohen, you were saying earlier that you were very nervous about appearing today. I can tell you that everyone here around the table is quite nervous about speaking about this delicate, sensitive topic before witnesses who are very knowledgeable. My first question I will address to Dr. Wyman.
Of the BC First Nation Health Authority in the area of MAID. And are you able to share any best practices or guidelines that the First Nations Health Authority has adopted with respect to MAID?
Thank you for that question. I should probably clarify that, First Nations Health Authority in many cases is not a direct medical service provider. However, we work in partnership with our regional health authorities. We actually have most recently formed an internal steering committee to, examine, look at, monitor the provision of MAID assessments and MAID itself in our province, although that work is just in the early stages. We have a couple of clinical nurse specialists who work for us in the Office of the Chief Nursing Officer who have liaised with service providers, MAID service providers, to First Nations people in British Columbia. And that's, for example, where I have heard the example of several First Nations people in British Columbia accessing MAID who met the eligibility criteria, the safeguards were in place, and they did receive a medically assisted death. Now, these are the positive examples. And as I mentioned, of course, that must be balanced with other people's hesitation and, perhaps not being as aware of medically assisted death in general, and particularly when it comes to mental disorder as the sole underlying medical condition coming up in terms of seeking a medically assisted death. So that work really is ongoing. I would say from my experience on the panel, however, that one of my fellow panel members, also an Indigenous physician, Dr. Sarah Goulet, is a MAID assessor and provider, and she described quite, I think, a terrific team. I can't think of a better word, multidisciplinary, that provides MAID assessments, not just in larger urban centers, but in fact travels to remote places to conduct MAID assessments and provision.
Merci beaucoup. J'ai tellement peu de temps. Ma prochaine question va être adressée.
I have so little time. My next question is for Dr. Barbès-Morin. The criminal code says at 241 1C, that to be eligible for medical assistance in dying, you have to be affected by serious and irremediable health problems. So that means that the person has persistent psychological and physical suffering which is intolerable to them and cannot be eased in conditions that the person deems to be acceptable. So are there treatments for some illnesses or disorders of a mental nature that are inaccessible and that unacceptable to the patients and could lead to intolerable suffering? That's an excellent question. It's something that we tried to explain in our document. Yes, there are some psychiatrical disorders that are very invasive. For example, a treatment which is a vagus nerve stimulation device that has to be implanted in the brain. Some people could decide that this treatment is too invasive for them, so that needs to be determined. So I would say that generally speaking, the range of treatments that we have access to in psychiatry in Canada, well, people hesitate when they they have a misunderstanding or a bad understanding. For example, there is electroshock therapy used for major depression, and which is regularly used. It's a treatment which has a great social stigmatization, and people refuse when they're not informed. It is a treatment that I use, that I provide to clients. When we sit down with the patients and we give the appropriate explanation, when we take the time that's needed, people generally understand well. And it's possible that there are such treatments that might be refused by someone as not being acceptable, but when people are helped appropriately, when somebody explains to them what the benefit is of these treatments and that they're simple to tolerate compared to many invasive treatments in physical medicine. That's all the time I have. Thank you very much, the witnesses.
Monsieur Thériault, for 5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. I would start, first of all, with Ms. Cohen. Good morning. Welcome to this committee. I'm a little perplexed. I understand that you left the expert group. You certainly must have read the report. When I read it at page 10, page 11, on the issue of determining the capacity, it stated when the assessment is so difficult or uncertain that the clinicians cannot establish that someone has the necessary aptitudes to consent in an informed way, the intervention is not provided. And further on, it said that if one is in a crisis situation, when there are suicidal tendencies, on page 11, it said in all situations where suicidal tendencies are a concern, the clinician must adopt 3 complementary perspectives. Take into account the capacity of the person to provide their informed consent or refusing care. Determine if interventions of suicide prevention, including involuntary ones, must be triggered. So we're far from medical assistance in dying. And proposing other types of intervention which might be helpful to the person. So in reading that report, it's clear that anyone who has mental disorders, personality disorders, who is suicidal, who's in their 20s, would have to have several decades before that person, where one day, after having tried the entire gamut of possible therapies, might possibly have access to medical assistance in dying. Assessment would have to be required there. What do you think of that part of the report? Are you for or against this?
I'm not really understanding the question. So in the report, it talks about alternative supports and alternative therapies and young people. I don't, I think that's good. And I think people should be offered supports, but it's not always just mental health supports and services. And the access to those services don't come that quickly. There's waiting lists. There's a million reasons why people don't access services and supports. And if somebody is, I didn't really understand your question. I understand that there were a lot of suggestions about offering people, you know, supports and services. However,
ça va,
where are
excusez-moi,
the- sorry.
je vais passer à une autre question avec un autre intervenant. C'est pas grave si vous n'avez pas compris ma question, mais je veux passer à autre chose. Docteur Morin, Barbès-Morin, certains de vos membres...
I will move to another person. Dr. Barbès-Morin, some doctors say that there's always a treatment that can ease suffering. Is that statement, and so many people are opposed to offering medical assistance in dying because the incurability is not always obvious in many cases. Do you consider that this comes out of a kind of medical paternalism or some kind of extraordinary view that there should be extraordinary life-sustaining treatment, to pretend that there's a treatment for everything, for easing any suffering, and so one should not have medical assistance in dying? It was said in Quebec.
Je vous répondrais que...
So I would say that it's an issue also in physical medicine with all kinds of neurological problems and disorders. There are doctors who can have that perception. I don't want to judge their level of paternalism, but in my personal experience, I can tell you that there are situations where people have had access to a whole wide range of incredible treatments. And unfortunately, their perception of their suffering is that it is intolerable. And I think that one has to recognize the capacity of those people to judge of their situation. It's not necessarily suicidal intentions, but people can evaluate or assess their suffering, and that must be listened to. It's not something specific to mental illness, but also physical illness.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, thank you, Madam Co-Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for helping guide this committee through a very serious subject matter, and one that I know many Canadians are paying attention to. Ms. Cohen, I'll start with you. I appreciate that you are nervous appearing before a parliamentary committee, but I can assure you that all members around this table do appreciate you being here, and we do want to make this as comfortable as possible for you. When you were talking in your opening statement about, you know, that this process has been rushed, I can understand the fears that you have with the timeline. You know, this joint committee, it did exist in the previous parliament, but it had to be reconstituted in this 44th parliament. And we've really only been underway since April. So we've been working with less than a year until March of next year, when the law will be changed, when mental disorders as a sole underlying condition will be allowed under our criminal code. I guess one of my questions to you, because I understand you did also make it very clear that you are not opposed to medical assistance in dying, but that you had very real concerns that there were no meaningful discussions on capacity, on vulnerabilities, and on specific safeguards. So given that our committee is ultimately tabling a report with recommendations to the federal government, do you have any comments on the specifically, should we recommend that the March deadline be pushed back? What additional steps would you specifically like to see the federal government take in addressing the concerns that you have so clearly outlined in your testimony?
First, I think I would like to see the government push the deadline back because this is unrealistic. I was signed on in June and we didn't start our first meeting until the end of August. So it was rushed, and I understand your panel, this process is being rushed as well. I'm not sure what the hurry is, but I know that we made many recommendations. Dr. Wyman remarked on Dr. Goulet's experience in Manitoba as a MAID assessor. We talked about teams. She talked about having a great team. I think there needs to be some kind of thought into how people, because it's difficult for doctors, as I understand as well. I clearly understood that as I was sitting at the panel, and I understand the difficulties. But I think that if this government is going to move forward, they need to help support the medical community to develop the processes collectively. There needs to be a common or a standard across the country so that things don't go off course. Mental health legislation, went off course. Every province does it differently. What I witnessed in Bill C-16 was that every province monitored differently, and some of the provinces had unknown categories. Way too many people dying from an unknown category.
Thank you for that. And
So-
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt. I think
That's
you
okay.
gave some great points there, but I do have limited time, and I do want to get one question in to Dr. Wyman. Dr. Wyman, thank you for joining our committee. I also hail from British Columbia. My riding of Couch and Malahat Langford has a very large Indigenous population, and so I very much understand the intergenerational trauma that exists among Indigenous nations in my riding. You have very clearly identified that broader engagement is necessary, and again, under the theme of us working with this March date that is rapidly approaching us, in your mind, what does that adequate consultation look like? What concrete steps should be the federal government start in this engagement process?
Very briefly, please. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think a large part of probably what needs to be done in terms of engagement is a listening to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit groups. I know you've had some representation here at these committee hearings, but that, in my opinion, probably is not sufficient. I think a large part, as I referred to in my opening remarks, has to do with communications. I think Indigenous people in Canada deserve, equal access to medical services, and that includes having access to MAID assessment and provision. But as I mentioned, that those misunderstandings and misperceptions need to be clarified for people. And that, I think, would go a long way towards alleviating some of the concerns that come out of those misperceptions.
Thank you very much. I will turn this over to my co-chair so that we can go to our round of questions from the senators.
Thank you, Senator Martin. Alors, on va commencer avec les questions.
So we will start with the senators' questions. Given that Senator Kutcher is not here, that time was given to Senator Miji. You have 6 minutes, Senator Miji. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses who have come today to inform us in our work. My first question, I will use Senator Kutcher's question, which is for Dr. Barbès-Morin. First of all, he wanted to know if you or your association agrees with the conclusions of the expert committee. would it be possible to tell me what the conclusion of the expert committee was? So all the conclusions and the general recommendations that were made by the committee. And he didn't specify which ones in particular. Well, I'm sorry, the kind of orientation of that report. Well, I'm sorry, I could not answer that question for my association because this is not something that we specifically discussed. So if I take a specific point for the measures for precautions, there's no need for specific measures for someone who just has mental illness. Something's. What we suggested in our report is a path, a way of putting in safeguards to make sure that the evaluation is conducted in an appropriate way. And I imagine it depends on each province. But this implies that there will be 2 psychiatrists involved in the evaluation. We identified minimal deadlines and also the respect of guidelines in terms of treatments. So in terms of safeguards, or to evaluate that the evaluation has been, or the assessment has been appropriately done, well, we have suggested a structured approach to the assessment to make sure that things are done in an appropriate way. So, as you have said that you are a psychiatrist in the Rouen-Noranda region, so in similar regions to yours, is access to psychiatrists sufficient, in your opinion? Well, that would depend about the region. This changes constantly. There can be a sufficient number of psychiatrists, or there may be not enough, and I'm convinced it's the same situation everywhere in Canada. What's important, in my opinion, is that the issue of access to services, access to care, is a very important one, and that should not be dealt with just because of MAID, but should be a priority for all the healthcare systems in Canada to make sure that people who have needs can have access to services, and that's true for all regions. I can talk about or say what I know. There are areas in Montreal where access is different currently. The population that's involved in MAID requests are people who have disorders or troubles throughout their life and who have had access to high-quality services during their life. And we must make sure that people who have mental illness continue to have quality services all the way through so they can find treatment and ease of their suffering all the way through. So this is a different issue, which is connected, but it is a fundamental issue. So now I have a question for Dr. Wieman. You talked about the ceremonial aspect of medical assistance in dying. Could you describe several aspects of this? And you have also said that Indigenous communities perceive MAID as a type of genocide. If a patient comes into your office, so person to person, doctor to patient, and tells you this, how would you deal with that? Do you let them have this concept of genocide, this idea of genocide, or do you try and inform them and enlighten them?
Thank you for those questions. I will try to be brief. I think for example, First Nations individual who is accessing a medically assisted death, it really is up to them to decide how they would like that to proceed. And for some people, that may involve including part of their culture and ceremony into that process. What I have heard and what I spoke to in my opening remarks were some case studies that I've heard of MAID being delivered to First Nations individuals in British Columbia, where the person did want aspects of ceremony included. And in fact, the community was aware, because many of our communities in British Columbia are quite small, was aware that this was happening on that particular day. And it is one example that I gave that that gives some idea of what a medically assisted death could look like for a First Nations person. And additionally, to the second question, I have spent most of my career working with Indigenous patients, as I mentioned, in a variety of settings. And the first thing that I do try to do when I meet patients is, hear where they're coming from. I think that's part of delivering culturally safe care. And so, of course, I would hear a concern such as a worry that, someone who would not be considered to be eligible for accessing a MAID assessment or provision. I would hear out their concerns because their concerns are valid. They're coming from their point of view. And then I would, obviously be able to spend some amount of time actually trying to provide the correct information or correcting those misperceptions that this is not medical assistance in dying, particularly for those with mental disorders, is not a form of genocide, and that there are people who are truly suffering and whose conditions, as Dr. Barbé-Morin mentioned, both of us, I think, have similar experiences. That in my decades of working in psychiatry, there were very few individuals that I could think of, probably less than 10, who I would think, based on my knowledge, would qualify for a medically assisted death under the MD-SUMC category.
Thank you, Dr. Wyman. Nous irons maintenant au sénateur Dalphon.
We will now go to Senator Dalphon with 3 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses. As I only have 3 minutes, I will ask my questions to Dr. Barbès-Morin. Dr. Morin, the reports of the authorities in Belgium and Holland says that MAID is only given to in 1% or fewer of the cases for mental illness. And you talk about your experience of 16 years. The sound is not coming through to the interpreter. Oh, sorry. We did not have your sound, Senator Dalphon, for a few minutes. You were muted for a while, so we'll start again. Yes, please. All right. 3 minutes are starting again. So I was thanking the witnesses for their presence here and saying, given I only have 3 minutes, I would ask Dr. Barbès-Morin. So health authorities in Belgium and Holland say that MAID is only granted in 1% or less of cases for reasons of mental disorders. And you say that in your experience of 16 years in practice, you identified 3 or 4 cases that might be eligible given the criteria that are in the criminal code now. But other people have testified to our committee and said that they have concerns that MAID might be too easy for someone who's depressed or someone who's going through a bad period in their life, who's lost their job, who has economic troubles, etc. Do you believe that federal standards are necessary to ensure that there is uniformity in this or consistency in this way, and to make sure that MAID is only granted in most serious cases? Or do you think that the medical or professional practice is sufficiently well structured to ensure such a result? Thank you for your question. First of all, for this federal provincial issue of managing standards that might be consistent throughout the country, well, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer as to is it better to respect the federal government or the provinces. Initially, it happened in Quebec, and then Canada followed, and things have evolved in a differentiated way, so things are different, so I don't want to answer in that way. But in terms of a framework, I think it's necessary to have a framework that defines parameters that are clear in terms of the assessment and that the parameters state what is assessed and what weight does one grant to the various parameters, and also to treatments that have been tried. So there has to be some kind of framework. So from what I know of the current act, which does deal with some of these aspects, but should be changed as we've suggested. So I understand that medical psychiatric practice is capable of creating these standards. Well, for the assessment of the seriousness of these ideas of seriousness, of presence of mental illness, so it's not just something that's a one-time crisis. Psychiatric practice is able to do that, and normally we work in teams, in multidisciplinary teams. That's already the case, and it must be also for this type of situation, for the assessment of the capacity. It's something that we're able to do in the case of serious mental illness. So yes, medical psychiatric practices can suffice for these ends. Thank you very much.
3 minutes. Senator Wallen, you're up for 3 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. My first question, I think I'll go to Dr. Wyman on this. We've had, I would say, conflicting testimony over the months, perhaps even years on this issue, with some parts of the Indigenous community thinking that medical assistance in dying is an attempted genocide. You're presenting another case that really we need the ability to incorporate traditional practices or rituals into the process for Indigenous individuals. So can you give us some sense? I know this is a hard one to do, but from the Indigenous population in general, would you say there is cultural resistance or not? Or could you quantify whether it's 50-50 or 60-40?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I'm not able to quantify. I think what I do believe in a couple of short statements is that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people deserve equal access to any medical treatments and procedures that are available to any other Canadians in this country, including MAID, and for those suffering from mental disorders. However, I think the issue and the conflict comes from people's understanding of what actually that is, and the pathway that someone must undertake to access a medically assisted death for MAID in general and MD-SUMC specifically. And I think people are misunderstanding, for example, the ease with which a medically assisted death might be obtained. And that's, that is clearly not the case, right? There are existing safeguards in the legislation. So I think that balance needs to somehow be found. And that is why I was saying, I think how that's going to be found is by having an engagement strategy, having a communication strategy, probably nationally and provincially, in order that people understand. Because my
But
concern is
something specific to the Indigenous community. Is that what you mean?
correct, because my worry is that there are people who are suffering in our communities who have a right to access a medically assisted death, but cannot or are not able to because of the level of misunderstanding and misperception in some communities.
So this is
Thank you, Senator
okay.
Wallen.
Sorry, thank you.
Time flies. Senator Martin, you have 3 minutes.
This is once more. Ms. Cohen, I wanted to come back to just, I guess, your experience on the expert panel and the fact that you felt it was definitely rushed and the deliberations were restricted. So I was wondering, your voice is missing from that report since stepping down, but what are some of the recommendations around monitoring and accountability that you would have liked to have seen in the report? Mike? Ms. Cohen, your microphone. There we go.
As for monitoring, ultimately, we need to make sure that people's experiences are being documented correctly. We need to understand and make sure that people who are choosing MAID, because they have no other choice, that their stories get told and we don't skip over those kinds of stories. It's really important to ensure that monitoring is a way for us to record and to manage the delivery of MAID. If we're not managing and we're not telling people stories, we are not going to be able to understand why people are choosing the difficult choice of MAID over life and what those reasons are.
Yes, and what about the concerns that you have raised around the capacity to consent, particularly in the context of patients suffering from a mental disorder being hospitalized and treated against their will?
Quite often, people who are put into the hospital against their will are treated and come out. And I think it's wrong to be, people are, in my opinion, people are being treated unfairly. If somebody is ill and they go into the hospital, they shouldn't have to be told that they have to stay there because of, and at the, I'm not really being clear. I'm sorry. I'm a little bit overwhelmed.
Yes, no, you have answered a lot of questions for us, so thank you very much. I don't think I have enough time for a third question, but thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now return the chair to Senator Martin.
Yes, so this concludes our first panel, and again, we want to thank our witnesses for your testimony and for answering all of our questions. We also wish that we had more time with each of you, but thank you very much, and we'll now suspend while we'll prepare for the second panel. Thank you. Just a few comments for the benefit of our new witnesses. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the joint chairs. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. An interpretation in this video conference will work like in an in-person committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. And when you are speaking, please keep your when you're not speaking, please keep your microphone on mute. So we'd like to now welcome both of the witnesses of our second panel, who are also here to discuss MAID when a mental disorder is the sole underlying medical condition. They are, as individuals, Ms. Justine Dembo and Dr. Nathalie Lesage, physician, clinical researcher, and MAID provider. Thank you to both for joining us this morning. We will have your testimonies 5 minutes each. First, Ms. Dembo, followed by Dr. Lesage, and then we will go into our first round of questions. So, Ms. Dembo, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm honored to have been invited today to speak with the Joint Committee. I'm a psychiatrist at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre in Toronto and an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, and I've been a MAID assessor since 2015. I've been engaged in MAID research since before Carter, and I have been teaching psychiatric residents and medical professionals, including MAID assessors and providers, about MAID on a regular basis. I'm currently part of the development of 2 MAID curriculum modules through the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers. I was an expert witness for the Touchant and Lamb cases, and I was also a member of the government expert panel. I'm speaking today as an individual, independent of my involvement with these organizations, and so the opinions I'm presenting are completely my own. I'm hoping to focus on a few important points. Firstly, I would like to emphasize that many committee members may be receiving incorrect information about how the MAID process actually unfolds on the ground. You may have been given by some individuals who are not involved in MAID assessment or provision false information regarding the degree of rigor and caution exercised by assessors and providers, as well as about the degree of care these medical professionals put into their work and the efforts they make to improve the quality of life of MAID requesters. I'm happy to walk you through how I approach MAID assessments if you ask that of me today. I urge you to be cautious in accepting comments about the MAID process by individuals who are not involved in the process directly. I urge you to remember that MAID assessors and providers are conscientious individuals who care about life and quality of life. They do not proceed unless they are satisfied after a thorough evaluation that a patient clearly meets all criteria and that proceeding is the right thing to do. All of us are doctors and nurse practitioners who entered medicine in order to help people and who remain deeply committed to that. I can speak only for myself, but I am part of a network of other MAID assessors and providers, and I have been witness to the immense efforts my colleagues make to ensure that they are leaving no stone unturned in their attempts to find other ways to help alleviate a patient's suffering, and in their efforts to ensure that patients are making a fully autonomous and capable choice free from coercion. Many of my Track 2 assessments, that is for patients who do not have a reasonably foreseeable natural death, proceed over the course of months to years with multiple visits and with the implementation of additional supports, interventions, and very creative attempts sometimes at improving quality of life. Secondly, I'm also concerned that the committee members have heard that MAID is being used as an alternative to the implementation of either better medical care or of psychosocial support, such as housing. I did address this concern in detail in the brief I submitted to you on May 9th, 2022, and I urge you to review that brief. For this moment, I will simply say that to phrase it in this way creates a false dichotomy. MAID is never a substitute for medical care or housing. Someone who requests MAID must be assessed in the totality of their circumstances, which requires taking into account issues such as whether a lack of adequate medical care or housing is contributing to the request. The safeguard requiring irremediability of the condition relates to this matter, and I urge you to review the government panel report section on grievous and irremediable medical conditions, as I fully stand behind the recommendations we made. The panel report states that MAID assessors should establish incurability and irreversibility with reference to treatment attempts made, the impacts of those treatments, and the severity of the illness, disease, or disability. The panel also states that, as with many chronic conditions, the incurability of a mental disorder cannot be established in the absence of extensive attempts at interventions with therapeutic aims. This means that someone who has not had access to adequate care would not be eligible for MAID. Therefore, MAID could never be used as a substitute for good psychiatric care. The panel recommendations were intended to build upon the strength of the already existing safeguards and guidelines, and I believe they do just that. I'm going to add that I strongly disagree with an earlier witness that there was no space for meaningful discussions about vulnerability. In fact, the panel discussed vulnerability at great length. The panel recommendations add additional guidance and protocols, and they provide detailed interpretations of the currently existing criteria. This will help to guide assessors and providers to understand better how to follow the law, both with respect to MAID in general and MAID in soul mental illness. Following these guidelines would ensure an extremely comprehensive, thorough, and cautious approach. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll stop there, and I welcome your questions today.
Thank you, Ms. Dembo. Next, we will have Dr. Lesage.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the committee for the invitation to testify in the context of this important study. I practiced and taught emergency medicine for over 30 years in a teaching center with an emergency department dedicated to psychiatry. I'm also a clinician researcher and was involved in the Research Ethics Committee of my institutions for 7 years. I am thus very familiar with the notions of capacity to consent to care, of suicide risk, of informed consent, and of the right to self-determination. I'm now at the end of my career, and I'm devoting myself exclusively to the practice of medical assistance in dying. In the emergency department, I've had the opportunity to assess hundreds of patients with mental illness in situations of decompensation. I remember, among other things, a patient who received excellent support from the network's multidisciplinary teams, but whose existing treatments seemed limited in their effectiveness. And one day, major physical problems arose, and she had decided to refuse the treatments. This was not enough after many years of suffering to bring her death, and she ultimately committed suicide after many years of suffering. Perhaps she could have died more peacefully. In addition, my past experience on the Ethics Committee has also enriched my thinking. In particular, I find that the current debate has great similarities with those concerning research ethics. It seems that under the pretext of protecting vulnerable populations, these people are ignored and excluded from the rules that are accepted for the general population. This paradoxically leads to discrimination against them and is, by definition, unethical. In fact, the current law already provides guidelines and safeguards for eligibility for medical assistance in dying, and these can very well be applied to mental illness. Of course, in cases of mental disorder as the sole medical problem invoked, one acknowledges certain difficulties in application, particularly as concerns the assessment of fitness, of incurability, and irreversible decline. In addition, it's not always obvious to distinguish suicidal ideation from a reasoned request for medical assistance in dying. In these circumstances, what safeguards should be put in place? As a provider of medical aid in dying, it seems important and appropriate to me that a psychiatrist's formal opinion be on file, confirming the incurability and the irreversibility of the patient's mental illness, as well as the absence of criteria that would represent a contraindication to medical assistance in dying. However, it does not seem to me to be mandatory that one of the two assessors be a psychiatrist, especially as a problem of availability would constitute a major barrier, particularly in remote areas. If the treating psychiatrist wishes to take on the role of assessor, it would, in my opinion, be entirely appropriate for them to take on this responsibility, as they would be able to adequately assess or appropriately assess the seriousness and incurability of the patient's illness, their degree of suffering, and their ability to give consent. In my opinion, imposing a second psychiatric assessment in these circumstances would constitute an additional barrier that would unduly reduce access to medical assistance in dying for these patients. In conclusion, it seems to me important to abolish discrimination in regards to access to medical assistance in dying for people with mental illness as their sole medical issue. It is possible to ensure that these people meet the criteria for eligibility through the use of adequate measures of supervision. However, these measures should not constitute insurmountable barriers for these patients who are suffering greatly. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer any questions you might have.
For appearing before our committee today. We'll go into our first round and begin with Mr. Cooper for 2.5 minutes, followed by Madame Vien for the remainder of the time.
Yes.
So, Mr. Cooper, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. I will direct my question to Dr. Dembo. In 2013, you wrote an article entitled "The Ethics of Providing Hope in Psychotherapy," in which you describe patient 1, a 38-year-old woman with schizophrenia and obsessive-compulsive disorder, with both illnesses proving resistant to multiple medications and psychotherapies, who had suffered 10 years of chronic and severe distress. You saw her in an intensive care unit, and after thoroughly assessing her and conducting a detailed review of the literature, you concluded that there was almost no likelihood that she could recover. Yet, instead of helping her die, you conveyed hope to her, and after an additional treatment attempt, her symptoms vanished and she has now remained well for 2 years. She is once again engaged in academic and advocacy work, as well as with friends and family, and grateful to be alive. You concluded that, quote, "In hindsight, it seems that we did the right thing, but at the time we could not have possibly known." So does that not underscore the determination of the expert panel of which you served on, that stated at page 9 that it is difficult, if not impossible, for clinicians to make accurate predictions about the future for an individual patient in cases of mental illness? And doesn't that demonstrate the significant risk in opening the door to sole mental illness, that persons will have their lives prematurely ended, persons like patient 1, but at the time MAID was not available?
Thank you for your question, Senator Cooper. You brought up some very important points. That publication is actually interesting because it's been brought up in some of the cases that I've testified for, where that was a situation where MAID laws did not exist in Canada. That patient was not assessed for MAID eligibility whatsoever, so we actually have no idea whether she would have been eligible for MAID or not. But also, that was 2 years of improvement and then followed by another deterioration, unfortunately. And so you're right, there is, and I agree with what we said in the panel, that it is challenging to predict irremediability in the case of sole mental illness on a case-by-case basis. That said, there's actually a degree of uncertainty that is equal to that in MAID on track 2 already. And even in track 1, we have uncertainty about whether a patient might change their mind or adjust to their life-threatening condition at the last minute. And so the key is, I think, to assess patients on a case-by-case basis, remembering that patients with autonomy and capacity are allowed to make decisions in the face of uncertainty in medicine all the time. And we, as the assessors, must share in that decision-making process with them and do the best we can.
Okay, Madame Vien.
But this kind of imperfection exists throughout medicine.
Thank you, Madame Vien.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Dr. Dembo, Quebec has decided to not move forward in this vein. Some people speak of discrimination when the possibility is raised of going ahead with mental illness in terms of MAID. What do you have to tell us about this aspect of discrimination when it's not available for mental illness and it is available for physical illness?
Can I just clarify if what you're asking is about the idea that it would be discriminatory to exclude patients with sole mental illness?
Absolument.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, yes, thank you for asking that question. Yes, I do believe it would be discriminatory on several levels. I mean, number one, people with mental illness, especially very chronic and severe mental illness, can suffer unbearably for decades. Their life course can be derailed, their personhood can be detracted from, they can be in physical pain as well as emotional pain. And their distress, their suffering is equally valid to the suffering of someone with what we're terming a physical condition. There's also the challenge that we can't fully distinguish physical from mental in many types of conditions, such as chronic pain, which would be eligible under Track 2. And so to say that someone with a mental illness just shouldn't be eligible, at that being a blanket statement where people don't even get the chance to be assessed as individuals in their unique circumstances, to me is very stigmatizing in the way that mental illness has a history of being stigmatized.
Thank you very much. And next we'll have Madame Brière.
Bonjour, merci.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Thank you to our two witnesses. This is testimony that's very complete, and we can see that your experience and your pathways are very useful for the work of the committee. Madam Dembo, I'll ask the question in French. I don't know if you have interpretation. You've already said that physical pain, just as psychological pain, can compromise taking decisions and informed consent. And in both situations, it's the person who should be assessed. So does that mean, in your opinion, that we should look at these requests on a case-by-case basis? And that, what is it that we have to assess ultimately?
Thank you so much, Senator. That's a really important question on a few levels. And so, yes, I think we're looking at the person. There's actually a writer on suffering within medicine, Eric Cassell, who talks a lot about suffering being a situation where the integrity of the person is threatened. And I think that applies to both physical and mental illness. Assessing on a case-by-case basis is the only way to get an understanding of that unique person, their needs, and their circumstances. Having an assessment creates a relationship between the assessor and the person being assessed. And it is also within that unique relationship that the assessor and the person being assessed can come to a shared understanding of the situation and can collaborate. So I think it is vital that people be assessed case by case rather than making a blanket statement. And yes, just with respect to your comment about physical pain, I think you're referring to what I mentioned around the severity of suffering, both physically and mentally. That's also something that I think can only be assessed qualitatively between the assessor and the person being assessed. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
And so, now, as concerns discrimination, we've heard that it's possible to assess people who have mental illness as their sole condition appropriately, and that the measures of the help that's given to these people should not be an obstacle for these people. Could you please tell us more about this? As Dr. Dembo said so well, currently the Act already gives criteria of eligibility And when a patient is considered to be eligible, these criteria have been assessed very rigorously. And in terms of mental illness, you have to understand that you're not talking about the neighbor who was depressed after their divorce. And I think it was in situations where the psychiatrist is capable of evaluating the irreversibility, the illness over a long course of a serious mental illness. So as provider of services, I will have all of these elements in hand. Since we've been giving medical assistance in dying with for people who don't have a reasonably foreseeable illness since March 2021. We're already faced by this type of situation with physical illness, this uncertainty related to prognosis, etc. And so we apply the criteria in order to be able to not create discrimination against this patient in the case of physical illness. In mental illness, we have exactly the same kind of issues. Is it possible to find a balance between an appropriate and adequate evaluation and the fact that we're not creating any obstacles for that person? What needs to be understood is that if there are too many barriers, adding additional difficulties to access to MAID, but add nothing in terms of the quality of the assessment and its rigor, that's where we have to be very careful. I met in Sherbrooke an organization called ProDev, working for the protection of people suffering from mental illness a few years ago. And these people were affirming that it was discriminatory that this population not be included as having access to MAID. So I share your opinion, and I was happy to hear your arguments. Thank you very much. Good morning. I wanted to address my question to Dr. Lesage. First of all, if I understood you clearly, it's not a question of having access to MAID if mental illness is the sole factor invoked, unless one has established that it's a chronic problem. So that continues in time. And related to this element of chronic illness, that there have treatments that were attempted. Did I understand that clearly? Was that right? Yes. As a provider of medical assistance in dying, the psychiatric evaluation has demonstrating a serious mental illness that does not respond to treatment and that is chronic in a significant way. So in the reports, decades were often mentioned. So it's clear that it's not a case of a first episode of a first suicide attempt at the emergency services where one would just come and or going to emergency in order to have recourse to MAID instead of suicide. It's not that. And as was said, it's not in replacement of a lack of resources or lack of access to care. So there's a very strong analogy with physical illness. So people who ask for MAID in their assessment, we have to make sure that they have had access to palliative care, to in order to try and relieve their suffering. And it's the same thing for mental illness. One have to make sure that patients have had recourse to something to relieve their suffering. But medicine has its limits. And so it has limits in cardiology and oncology and everywhere else. And so to think that there are no limits in psychiatry, that we have 100% success in treatments, if everything were perfect in terms of the network organization, that's totally untrue. That's the minimum. So I don't have much time left, but talking about additional barriers or obstacles that might or be related to accessibility. In the expert report, recommendation 10 states that it would take an assessor who's an independent psychiatrist as an assessor, so who's independent of the treating or the person that offers the service. So your experience in the field does not really confirm this. Your understanding of what would be possible in terms of deploying MAID, there would be that you say that there could be a problem in the availability of psychiatrists. Could you please talk about this briefly? I may have another question. So is the question for Dr. Dembo or for myself? It's for you. So I think that generally speaking, that was often mentioned. These patients have already been assessed by one, if not several psychiatrists. One can suppose that patients who would be eligible would be patients with serious incurable illnesses. So to add additional assessments with conditions of being in remote areas and even in the city, it can often be very difficult and be an additional obstacle in terms of being rigorous. Does the March 2023 deadline, is that a realistic deadline? And from what you know of your experience in the field, and this is a question for Dr. Dembo, do you think that we are able to provide this service and to do our work rigorously with this March 2023 deadline?
Thank you for that question. I think whether or not March 2023 is a realistic deadline depends on how committed and efficient various provincial bodies and local bodies can be in implementing guidelines based on the panel report. I am hoping that they can do that. I would also say, though, that putting that aside, MAID assessors and providers have been assessing patients on track 2 for quite some time now, and it's very similar, the issues that come up in track 2 and mental illness. And so I actually think that already assessors and providers are getting practice and are prepared to be able to implement the recommendations by March 2023.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I turn this to Mr. McGregor, I'm going to also turn it over to our co-chair, Mr. Garneau. Thank you. So, Mr. McGregor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair, and thank you to Dr. Dembo and Dr. Lesage for guiding our committee through this subject matter. Dr. Dembo, I'd like to start with you. In the history you have in treating patients, and just with how intimately familiar you are with some of their conditions and so on, like, as a percentage of the patients that you have seen, like, how many would you say would actually qualify for medical assistance in dying where a mental disorder is the sole underlying condition? We're just trying to get a sense of what the population would be in this regard.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, that's an important question and a difficult one to answer because the law has not yet changed. That said, when I think of overall the patients that I see, I work with a population of highly treatment-resistant patients with OCD who get sent to our tertiary care center. Most of them have other comorbid illnesses like depression that is also severe. Some of them have talked with me about MAID for sole mental illness, and I follow a few who ultimately would like to proceed. I'd say the percentage who would likely be eligible is relatively small of those who would like to proceed with MAID that I follow at this time. But I would also say that the percentage of patients with severe psychiatric illness who ultimately would want to even be assessed for MAID is very small. And the percentage of people who have irremediable conditions are small. So I can't give you a number, but I would say that the majority of people who would apply based on what I'm seeing the applications might look like would probably not be eligible.
No, thank you for that. That was an answer. And my next question is, we've heard concerns with the fact that, like every other field of medicine, the development of treatments is always expanding. New research is going on, et cetera. And I guess some of our witnesses have related their concern that someone could qualify for medical assistance in dying, and then maybe in a few years' time a treatment comes out which is successful in treating that condition. We don't yet know, but just can you clarify that, for physicians, especially for assessors, they would consider it a duty of care to have done their research in the most advanced state of research that's available for treatment right now. Can you just expand on that a bit more?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, I'd say in any aspect of medicine, there's always the chance that another treatment is around the corner that could cure or significantly help that patient. And any patient making a decision about withdrawal of life support or MAID or other highly consequential decisions does run the risk of missing out on something that may have helped a few years in the future. And part of assessing capacity to make these decisions includes an assessment of the person's ability to understand that. And so I think I lost track of the second part of your question.
Just,
if I may actually ask you to repeat.
Whether it's considered a duty of care to just be apprised of all of the latest research and treatment.
Yes, thank you so much. So I believe that it is, and in the reading of the expert panel report, I hope it comes across that in one of our recommendations, not only do we suggest an independent psychiatrist who's an expert in the condition, but that we may sometimes require two psychiatrists. We may sometimes require subspecialist consultation to make sure that no stone has been unturned, to make sure that someone with expertise in that person's specific psychiatric condition would also be able to assess and provide information on the most recent or even experimental treatments that might be worth trying before proceeding with MAID.
And for my final...
And that is certainly clinically how I handle it and how my colleagues handle it.
Thank you. And for my final question, you provided an answer just on the March date that is rapidly approaching to us. But, we've already produced an interim report on this subject. There have been a flurry of other reports as well. What do you think this parliamentary committee should be producing in terms of recommendations specifically to the federal government when we get to a point where we're ready to table our final report?
I'm hoping I'm understanding your question correctly. My inclination is to say that I actually do very much stand behind all of the recommendations we made on the expert panel, and I would hope that those recommendations be translated into guidance items and protocols for provincial and local authorities to follow once they start receiving these MAID requests. I think that needs to be implemented, and I would like to see that moving faster than it is.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Nous irons maintenant aux sénateurs.
We will now go to the senators. Given that we only have two senators, I will offer up to 7.5 minutes to each senator. We will start with Senator Mégy. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Dr. Dembo. Given that you're someone who works in the field, but you're also doing research, I would like you to describe the process to determine eligibility for MAID, the length of time for each step to the committee. When we were talking about the general population, it was a question of how long these steps would take and that things were delayed, etc. So the length of each step concerning people with mental disorders.
Question, and may I ask you, oh, and that was for me, am I correct?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. May I ask you if it would be all right if I partly read from something that I previously had prepared where I actually walk through the process of a MAID assessment?
Yes.
Or would you prefer I was more brief?
OK, mais la durée des étapes, êtes-vous capable de nous en parler un petit peu? Ben, c'est juste une réponse courte, là.
I'm so sorry, the interpretation.
The length of the each step, could you give us a brief answer?
It really depends on the patient. Right now, remember, we're not assessing people for sole mental illness, but using patients on track 2 as an example, I can expand on how that might apply. The first step is always to gather the information provided by the person referring the patient to me. That takes a lot of work, reading through all of the person's previous charts that have been provided to me and the reasons for the referral. Then there's meeting with the patient. Initial meeting is usually 2 hours, and that's usually not the only time that we meet. I suspect for sole mental illness, it will be much more than just a few meetings, but probably several 2-hour meetings over the span of months to possibly years. So it could be a very lengthy time span, as it has been with track 2. In between steps, one wants to look at whether the patient has been offered appropriate treatments and has seriously considered them. And that can involve having them go through certain interventions, not just medical treatments, but interventions involving finance and housing and social supports. And all of that takes time to put into place. So these serial assessments would occur over a long period of time, in my view. I hope that helps.
OK. Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. So that's my understand. If we're asking for a second psychiatric assessment, that can double the obstacles. Did I understand that clearly?
There are real obstacles to obtaining psychiatric assessments for MAID, even for track 2 patients right now. And I expect that there will be delays for patients who are waiting for an expert psychiatrist opinion on their MAID request for mental illness. And especially if a second specialist is required, yes, another delay. I think right now, the way things are, that is unavoidable.
Merci.
Thank you. My second question is for Dr. Lesage. As you know, people with mental illness are often stigmatized in society. Do you think, because you did say that the exclusion of these people is discriminatory, how do you perceive the negative consequences this might have on the stigmatization of these people? Thank you very much for this question. I can tell you already that my experience in the field brought me to assess patients for physical illnesses in the context of the current act for MAID, but patients who also had, in spite of having a physical illness that met all of the eligibility criteria, also a mental illness that could be important enough to require a psychiatric evaluation to make sure that all the various factors that, as we said, factors that are very sensitive in the situation of mental disorders. And what I noted was that often the attitude of the people in the health network were often different, and they would cease to see the physical problems, physical health problems of the patients that led to their eligibility. And it's as though if the patient has mental illness problems, the patient is not suicidal. They satisfy all criteria. But despite that, one could observe a discrimination which often delayed even hearing their request for MAID. So already that's discrimination that I observed. As we've been saying since the beginning, I think that mental illness as the sole factor invoked will be exceptions. All psychiatrists say that. But closing the door for them, it's not hearing their suffering, it's not being empathetic. And for me as a doctor, this is unacceptable. Thank you. If I have any time, I will give it to Senator Delphon. So, Senator Delphon, you have about 8.5 minutes. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Many topics have already been covered, so I'm not sure I'll need all that time, but witnesses are invited to not feel too rushed.
Dr. Dumbo. Doctor, you were a member of the task force, and obviously that group has come up with a substantive report. Are you confident that the task force guidelines are sufficient? Because you certainly have followed some criticisms that were expressed further to the release of the report. Has that brought you to change your mind or to say that maybe we should have also said something about the following issues? So is there something you would like to say, our task force report is fine, the guidelines are sufficient, or after further thought, I will recommend that we have the following?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I do believe that the expert panel recommendations are very comprehensive and thorough. I actually have thought about that at length, and I can't think of anything that I would want to add or feel the need to add. Partly I say that because I think the pre-existing safeguards that have already been in place for track 2 are actually quite thorough if they are followed appropriately by assessors and providers. And so I think along with the recommendation that's in the panel report that assessors and providers be trained in a standardized way, and I hope you know that there are training programs being developed, and I'm actually part of development of those training modules. If assessors receive that additional training, they can provide assessments in a more standardized way, and they can follow the existing guidelines, the existing safeguards that are already there, plus the additional elements that are added in through the panel report that I think refine what is already there and that make it, that allow assessors to interpret the current legislation even more clearly. So I'm actually quite satisfied with the way the report elaborates upon that. My only concern is to make sure that it is followed and that the recommendations are implemented locally.
I understand that Dr. Lesage, I think, referred to it before, that when there's comorbidity and we have somebody who's in track 2, the process involves an assessment of the ability to consent and the ability also to, and the need to make sure that the request is not based for the mental, for improper mental reasons, but is based on the kind of a comorbid. You have to do a mental assessment. In other words, is the practice already familiar to a certain extent to assessing mental conditions as a cause for access to MAID?
Is that question for me as well?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's actually a very important point. We have already been assessing capacity for MAID in people who have serious mental health conditions, who have a comorbid physical disorder that makes them eligible. And that's not just on track 1, but also, not just on track 2, but also on track 1. And psychiatrists are trained in capacity assessment to begin with. Capacity assessment in other highly consequential medical decisions, such as withdrawal of life support or the ability to refuse life-sustaining treatment. And so I think much of this is already familiar. There are always going to be nuances, but I don't think those nuances are specific to the diagnosis, such as a diagnosis of a mental illness, but the nuance is going to be specific to each patient in each of their own unique circumstances.
So in a sense, when we'll be transiting in March to having access to track 2, including for those that have their sole condition is a mental condition, the system won't be taken as a surprise and in a completely new setting that they were not familiar with. That's what I understand from your answer.
My sense is that those of us who have been providing assessments for track 2 will not feel surprised. I do think the system will struggle because my understanding is that there are very few assessors who right now feel willing to accept those cases. And so there will be a bottleneck in terms of the number of applications versus the psychiatrists willing to do those assessments. But I actually don't see that as a terribly negative thing. It does absolutely put up an obstacle, but on the other hand, it allows for assessments to be more longitudinal just naturally as it unfolds.
Thank you. Dr. Lesage, ma prochaine question sera pour vous.
Dr. Lesage, my next question is for you. Some witnesses were concerned about the fact that certain mental illnesses are associated with suicidal tendencies. You alluded to that earlier. What do you do in these cases to avoid that person be found eligible? So an objection is to prevent people who have suicidal tendencies to go and ask for MAID. The question is for me? Yes, Dr. Lesage. Sorry, I didn't hear that. So, in fact, I feel that I'm repeating myself, but we're not faced with a crisis situation. When I said that at the emergency department, I worked with a lot of patients in a crisis situation. It's not those patients in a crisis situation who will become eligible. And then I will put myself in my role of assessor and provider of MAID. It's certain that during a moment of crisis where the patient is highly suicidal, none of these patients will be admissible or eligible. We are in a situation of an assessment of patients who may have had repeated crises that were very frequent and long and frequent hospitalizations. So where that patient has the capacity to express their suffering and is not in a suicidal period, they can be evaluated by the team and the psychiatrist. But we're not in a situation where the patient is in a suicidal crisis. These patients would not be eligible. And a question for you, Dr. Lesage. Yesterday I was listening to the debate of the Quebec election campaign, and one topic that was raised by just about all the candidates was the lack of sufficient resources for mental health. Is there a danger that resources that are already insufficient be used more for assessment for MAID and worsen the problem, or is the health system capable to manage the increased request for assessments by psychiatrists for MAID? Well, here I'm going to make another comparison with physical illness. You know, since MAID has been allowed in our country, in fact, contrary to what many had thought, the offer of health and support has helped the situation of healthcare, because we have to make sure that those patients have had access to various options in healthcare. We have to make sure that their suffering is not related to the fact that there are shortages or gaps in the network. So we see that these patients have access to palliative care and they don't want them anymore, and that their choice is for MAID. So with a patient with mental illness as a sole condition there, we have to evaluate that it is not a question of the network having gaps. We have to make sure that everything was put in place to help that patient. But all psychiatrists say the cases are quite rare, and they've already have used all the resources of the network for years. Thank you very much.
Panel, I would
Excusez-moi,
like to
Monsieur le
thank our...
Président. Excusez-moi, Monsieur
Oui,
le
Madame
Président.
Michi.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, can I just make a request, a 5-second request of Madame Dembo? Go ahead. Dr. Dembo, I believe I understood that you had some notes that you had written that might be useful for our committee. Could you send us those written notes to the clerk of our committee?
Send them later on today.
Thank you,
Merci.
Dr. Dembo. I'd like to thank Dr. Dembo et Dr. Lesage. Merci de nous avoir.
And thank you, Dr. Lesage, for having given us your time today and told us about your experience and answered our questions for a very important study.
That you took the time to be with us to answer all of our questions. With that, this committee is adjourned. Thank you.